So around the experiments, Chase had a question asking how long will the experiments take from start to finish with all the results?
I missed some of that, Vanessa. The audio kind of warbled there in the middle of your question.
Oh, basically Chase was just asking how long will the experiments take to
Ah,
conduct?
well, these experiments have not ever been done before, so it's a little chancy to predict exactly how long they're going to take. When you're doing experiments, they seem real easy when it's just in your head, and you can see how it's done. But then where the time gets used up is in trying to get the equipment to work and work right, and not have noise, and not pick up vibrations from the outside world, and this sort of thing. So there's lots of issues that come up with actually doing the experiment itself that takes time. You have to get the right equipment. Sometimes you buy equipment, you think it's right, but it doesn't quite work, and then you have to get more, and all of that takes time. So I don't know exactly, but if we get enough funding, the funding that we have as a minimum, that $150,000, that is a bare minimum for us to do a few experiments and make a little documentary about doing it. If we get more than that, we'll be able to do more experiments. And to get probably to do all the experiments, it's going to cost more, in the 300,000 or so, like double that, I'd say, to get all the experiments done. But once we get a few done, that will encourage people to take us more seriously, if they work. So
Yeah.
that's part of it. So I don't know, but I'm hoping that if we get sufficient funds to do them all, we'll be able to do them all in less than a year. Probably the quickest would be about 6 months. It just takes time. I mean, it's going to take a month or so just to get the equipment together and start putting it together, and finding a good place. We have some lab space now that we can use. We're not sure exactly where we're going to do the experiments yet, or who's going to do them. That will take some time. So if you add all these things together, if we get it all done within 6 months or a year, I think that'd be about as much as anybody could hope for. There are about 17 experiments. That's a lot of physics experiments. Even though if you get the equipment and get them going, some of them will kind of be easier then. The first setup, before we get the first one done, may take us 4 or 5 months. But after that, they ought to come along a lot quicker. So it's not going to be long, though. It's not like, a decade from now we'll have the answers. It's not that sort of thing. This is short term. I very purposely made these experiments such that they were, as experiments go, easy and cheap. But that doesn't actually mean they're easy or cheap, either one. Just as experiments go, physicists typically do experiments in teams of 4 or 5 or 6 people, sometimes more. When you read a physics paper that's experimental, there's usually at least 5 names at the top of the paper. And these come from multiple institutions. And those institutions pool resources. And they work on this research project for 2 or 3 years, before they get a publication. That's kind of the typical physics experiment. It takes, 2 or 3 years, and it costs a lot of money, and there's a lot of people involved. Well, when I say that ours are simple and easy, I mean relative to that. I think we can probably do it all in a year for probably, $300,000 or so. So so we'll see how much money we get, how quickly we can work on it, whether we get the equipment together, find the right people, and finding the right people is going to be key. We really need some smart people who have a lot of prior experience in setting up this quantum optics kind of experiments. They're familiar with the equipment. Otherwise, we could spend 6 months just coming up on the learning curve, trying to figure out how to make all the equipment work together. So somebody who really knows what they're doing is already smart about that. They can put it all together maybe in a month instead of 6 months it'll take us if we're doing it for the first time. So it just depends if we find the right people, find the right space, and if we can afford it. But it's not a big impossible thing. Sometimes in physics there'll be an experiment but there's really no way to actually implement the experiment just yet. You know, like some of the ones that Walker came up with. Well, he did some of those. Walker, is that right? Did I get the right word?
Wheeler?
Wheeler, yeah, the ones that Wheeler did. You know, he just had one that was finally executed in Australia just a year or so ago. And Wheeler came up with that experiment 25 years ago. You see, so it took 25 years before the equipment came available to actually do the experiment. And that's not that unusual in physics, that people come up with experiments, but they're not really doable very quickly. They're hugely expensive, and we have to spend a few decades creating better tools before we can do them. Well, these experiments aren't like that. So for those of you that may be worried, you know, well, is this going to be a decade? You know, how long is this going to take? Can you do it? No, they're really cheap and easy as these things go, which means if everything works right, yeah, a year or less, we ought to be able to get it done.
Yeah.